She was rejected for being too poor to be loved. He was a widowed single dad, one mistake away from losing everything. They had no money, no future, no reason to believe in miracles. But sometimes the most beautiful things grow in forgotten fields. And sometimes love doesn't come to rescue us. It comes to rebuild us. If stories like this speak to your heart, stories about quiet strength, unexpected kindness, and love that heals, we'd love to have you here. Click subscribe and join us on this journey of hope and second chances, because the world still needs stories like this. Now, let's begin the story of struggling single dad meets too poor. Mail order bride. Together, they build a love worth millions. The sky over Montana was the kind of cold blue that made your breath catch, not from the temperature, but from the weight of everything it covered. Jake Turner stared at the horizon from the front porch of his creaking farmhouse, a chipped mug of black coffee cradled in his weathered hands. The fields stretched out in tired silence, frost-kissed and empty, like him. The wind rolled across the prairie, brushing against the porch rails like a memory too worn to speak. Behind him, the screen door creaked open. "Daddy, your coffee's cold." Jake turned to see a little girl in flannel pajamas and wild chestnut curls rubbing her eyes. Annie, 6 years old, and far too familiar with grown-up silences. She didn't ask why he sat out there alone most mornings. She just brought warmth, in the form of a blanket or a blanket-like sentence. He smiled faintly and pulled her onto his lap. "It still works," he said, sipping anyway. "Just needs a little grit." Annie rested her head on his shoulder, and for a moment the world quieted. But the silence was deceptive. Jake knew the storm was coming, not the kind that darkened skies, but the kind that arrived in envelopes. The farm was 2 months behind on payments. The last harvest barely covered gas and feed, and the barn roof, patched with more hope than shingles, leaked like a broken promise every time it rained. He was holding it all together with duct tape, prayer, and the stubbornness inherited from his father, who died on this land with dirt under his fingernails and pride in his chest. But Jake had something his father didn't: debt, loneliness, and a 6-year-old who missed her mother every time she looked at the empty chair at the dinner table. The hardest part wasn't the bills, it was the way Annie's laughter had changed. It used to burst like sunshine. Now it was quieter, as if she were afraid to be too happy in a house that had forgotten how. Later that night, after tucking her in and reading Goodnight Moon for the 100th time, Jake sat at the kitchen table with a flickering laptop and a satellite connection that lagged just enough to make him regret every click. He wasn't sure why he did it. Loneliness, maybe, or maybe it was the silence. The kind of silence that settled on a man like dust until he couldn't tell the difference between stillness and being forgotten. He typed in the address from a flyer he'd half crumpled weeks ago, AmeriBrides.net, a mail-order bride site. A last resort for men who lived too far out, too long alone, and too tired to pretend they could start fresh the traditional way. He wasn't looking for love. He wasn't even sure what he was looking for. A companion, maybe, a cook. Someone who wouldn't look at his hands and see failure. Someone who didn't know the town, the stories, the rumors about the Turner boy who married for love and buried her before she hit 30. Profiles loaded slowly. Most were overdone. Studio-lit portraits, full makeup, bios that sounded like they were written by someone else. He was about to close the screen when one photo caught his eye. It wasn't sharp, it was grainy, poorly lit. A young woman in a scarf and second-hand sweater, standing in front of a wooden cart of dried herbs. Her name, Lena Petrov. Country, Bulgaria. Age, 28, and the bio, 1 line. "I only bring my hands and my heart, but I will work with both." Jake stared at that sentence longer than he should have. No emojis, no promises, no pretending. Just honesty, and a quiet kind of strength. He clicked contact, then stared at the screen, unsure if he'd done something desperate or just human. The next morning, he received a reply. "Thank you for writing. I have not been chosen before. I do not expect much, but I can cook, I can clean, I know how to dry herbs and make oils. My grandmother taught me. I am not afraid of dirt." It wasn't poetry, it was something better. Real. Jake looked out at the fields again, still empty, still unforgiving, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely alone. And as the wind swept across the prairie once more, he whispered to no one in particular. Maybe there's something left worth trying for. The airport terminal was far too clean to feel safe. Lena Petrov sat alone on a cracked plastic bench near Gate 17, a fraying backpack at her feet and a handwritten name tag folded into her coat pocket. It still read Mrs. Bradley, though the man who'd printed it never even made it to arrivals. She'd waited, with her hands clenched tight and her chin high, until the realization sank in that no one was coming. Again. That had been 4 weeks ago. Since then, Lena had moved through the edges of the city like a ghost. Her tourist visa was still valid, barely. She cleaned rooms in exchange for cash. She slept in a women's shelter, then in a shared apartment with 6 others, until she could no longer ignore the stares, the murmurs in the hallway. Too poor, too foreign, too naive. It wasn't new. Back home in Bulgaria, she'd grown up in a village where being poor meant being invisible. Her mother had left when she was 10. Her grandmother had raised her, feeding her soup made of weeds and hope, teaching her how to dry lavender, crush mint, and boil rose petals until the air sang with scent. It was all Lena had, and in the city none of it mattered, until Jake Turner's message arrived. It had been late. Her back ached from scrubbing floors. She hadn't checked the mail order site in weeks. She didn't expect messages anymore, not real ones. But there it was. "I have a small farm in Montana. It's falling apart, but I'm still standing. My daughter and we could use someone real." It wasn't romantic, it wasn't pleading, it was honest, and honesty had become the rarest kind of currency. So now she was here, clutching a printed one-way ticket to Billings, Montana, and a piece of paper with a stranger's name and phone number. Jake Turner. American. Farmer. Widower. The final boarding call echoed through the terminal. Lena stood slowly, every part of her protesting. She hadn't slept much. Her coat smelled faintly of rosemary, one of the few scents that still made her feel like home. She reached into her backpack, brushing her fingers against the small tin of salve she'd made the night before. Calendula and beeswax. Useless here, but it gave her courage. She boarded the plane without a word. Jake had never been one for airports. Too loud. Too many people walking too fast in too many directions. But there he was, holding a cardboard sign with her name scribbled in black marker, Lena. He felt foolish. He hadn't told anyone in town she was coming. People already talked too much. About his debt, about Annie, about how grief had turned him into a ghost of the man who once smiled in Sunday church. But when he saw her, shoulders hunched, eyes scanning the crowd with that cautious hope he recognized too well, he stood up straighter. She was smaller than he'd imagined. Not fragile, but compact. Grounded, like someone who had carried weight too long to be surprised by much. Their eyes met. She stopped walking. Jake gave a hesitant nod, raised the sign an inch. She walked toward him, slowly, as if each step required permission. When she reached him, neither spoke. He offered his hand. She shook it, firm and brief. "You made it," he said. "Yes," she replied softly, her accent lilting. "Thank you for answering." Jake wasn't sure what to say. So he took her bag, and they walked in silence to the parking garage. The drive from Billings to the farm took nearly 2 hours. The sun had begun to sink, painting the sky in wide, trembling bands of gold. Jake kept glancing sideways, unsure if silence was a problem. Lena sat quietly, hands folded on her lap. She didn't fidget, didn't check her phone, just stared out the window like someone memorizing the landscape, in case it vanished. "You okay back there?" he asked once, glancing at Annie in the rearview mirror. Annie nodded, but said nothing. She hadn't spoken a word since Lena got in the truck. "She's shy," Jake said, more to fill the space than anything. "I understand," Lena replied. "So am I." Jake almost smiled. When they arrived, the sky had turned the color of slate. The farmhouse loomed against the horizon, weather-beaten, stoic, tired. Jake helped her with the bag, opening the creaky front door with a quiet, "Watch the step." Inside, Lena took it in. The wooden floors, the faded quilt on the couch, the kitchen smelling faintly of burnt coffee and something sweeter, cinnamon maybe. It was not beautiful, but it was clean. Honest. "This is yours?" she asked gently. Jake nodded. "Was my parents'. Then mine. It's old, like everything else." "I like old things," Lena said. "They remember." He paused at that. After a moment, he gestured toward the guest room. "You can rest here. I'll show you around in the morning." She nodded. "Thank you." Jake turned to leave, then stopped. I don't expect anything, not right away." Lena looked up, her gaze steady. "I know. I didn't come to be chosen. I came to choose." That stunned him a little. He didn't say goodnight, just nodded and stepped out. In the hallway, Annie waited. Jake knelt. "What do you think?" Annie whispered. "She smells like flowers." He chuckled. "She does, doesn't she?" But long after he tucked Annie in, long after the house had settled into its creaks and groans, Jake lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what kind of woman came across the world not hoping to be saved, but ready to start again. The morning air smelled of damp earth and faded hay, familiar and grounding. Lena stood on the porch barefoot, her arms wrapped around herself as if the silence might bite. But it didn't. It just lingered, the way old grief did. Quiet, settled, not asking for anything except to be noticed. Inside the house, the floor creaked under small feet. Annie was awake. Lena had heard her before the sun rose, padding lightly across the hall to the kitchen. She moved with a child's caution, as if still unsure whether her presence was welcome in her own home. Lena understood the feeling all too well. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and looked toward the fields. From this distance, the land looked still and unbothered, but up close she had seen the weeds choking the soil, the fence posts leaning like tired old men. It wasn't just the farmhouse that carried wounds. This place, this land, had forgotten how to bloom. Jake emerged onto the porch with a tin cup of coffee, nodding toward her. "Didn't hear you come out." "I like the morning," Lena said. "It's honest." He grunted in agreement and leaned against the railing. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. It wasn't uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. Lena gestured toward the field. "What do you grow?" "Used to be wheat, barley too sometimes, had pumpkins when Annie was a baby." He paused. "Now, mostly hope." Lena smiled faintly. "That's hard to harvest." Jake looked at her, surprised at the gentle humor. He hadn't expected that. She turned toward him. "Do you still believe it can work? The land?" He stared out at the field. "I don't know. Some days I think if I dig any deeper, I'll hit the other side of disappointment." Lena didn't laugh. She just nodded. "Breakfast?" he asked. She followed him inside. In the kitchen, Lena moved like someone who had lived in 100 kitchens without ever belonging to one. She didn't ask where things were. She simply opened drawers and cupboards, memorizing the layout, taking mental stock. Jake sat at the table, watching quietly as she cracked eggs, sliced bread, and placed a small bundle of dried herbs into a pot of water. "What's that?" he asked. "Mint, lavender, chamomile, for her." Lena glanced toward the hallway. Jake looked surprised. "Annie?" "She has shadows under her eyes." "Trouble sleeping?" He nodded slowly. Lena poured water into 2 mugs and set one in front of him. "Try." Jake took a cautious sip. It was floral and earthy, with a bite of something bittersweet. "You made this?" "I used to help my grandmother," she said simply. She believed nature holds memory, that it can teach the body how to rest. Jake blinked. "You talk like a poet." "No," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I talk like someone who used to believe in magic." Annie shuffled into the kitchen, her small fingers clutching a ragged stuffed rabbit. She stopped short when she saw Lena, then slid into the seat beside her father without a word. Lena placed a plate in front of her, scrambled eggs, toast, and a drizzle of honey. Annie looked at the food, then up at Jake. "It's okay," he said softly. "She made it." Annie picked up a fork and began eating in small, careful bites. Jake exhaled. Small victories. Lena didn't push conversation. She simply sat beside them, sipping her tea, letting the silence do its work. Later that morning, Jake gave Lena a tour of the property. She followed him past the leaning barn, the rusted water tank, the chicken coop with more dust than feathers. "This is a lot," she said. "Yeah," he admitted. "My dad used to say land only gives back what you're willing to bleed into it." "Then maybe," she said gently, "it's time to teach it something softer." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "Like patience, or scent, or memory." He gave her a look that balanced between confusion and curiosity. They reached the back edge of the property, where a gentle rise rolled into a forgotten meadow. Wild grasses swayed in the breeze, tangled with patches of purple and silver green. Lena's breath caught. She stepped forward, crouched, and touched the blossoms with reverence. "Do you know what this is?" "Overgrown lavender, maybe some mint," Jake said, "mostly weeds." Lena looked up. "These are not weeds, these are healers." Jake crossed his arms. "Never knew how to sell healing." "Then maybe you just never tried the right way." She stood slowly, eyes scanning the field. "This place, this could be more than food. It could be medicine, fragrance, memory, safety." Jake studied her face. For the first time since she arrived, Lena looked not like a guest, or even a survivor, but like someone standing exactly where she belonged. That night, after Annie was asleep and the air had cooled with dusk, Lena sat on the porch again. Jake joined her without a word, bringing 2 mugs of the herbal tea she'd prepared. They sipped in silence, watching stars begin to prick the sky. "She smiled today," Jake said, after a long moment. Lena looked at him. "Annie, at dinner, just a little, but it was real." Lena nodded. "Children know when it's safe to grow." Jake turned to her. "Why did you come here, really?" She thought for a long time before answering. "I came because the world told me I was too poor to be chosen. I wanted to find a place where I could build something, even if it was small, even if no one else saw its worth." Jake didn't respond. He didn't have to. They both understood that sometimes the richest beginnings came from the most broken soil. The next morning, the sunlight broke gently over the hills, sifting through the kitchen windows like flour through an old sieve. Lena stood at the counter in her soft gray dress, slicing apples with quiet precision. The scent of cinnamon, cloves, and something faintly citrusy filled the air. Jake entered with boots still damp from dew, brushing his jacket off at the door. He paused mid-step. The kitchen, for the first time in years, felt awake. "I don't remember the house ever smelling this good," he said, attempting casualness. Lena looked over her shoulder. The apples were turning. "I didn't want to waste them." He nodded, then added, "You didn't have to cook." "I know," she replied, "but I can, so I did." There it was again, that simple, unshakable logic. Jake found it both disarming and oddly comforting. She handed him a small bowl of warm, spiced apple slices. He took a bite and blinked. "That's better than pie." She smiled with a quiet pride. No crust to disappoint. Jake laughed, an actual laugh, low and gravelly, and for a moment Lena looked genuinely startled by the sound. Then she laughed too. Just once, but it echoed like music in the wood-paneled kitchen. Later that morning, Lena asked to return to the field at the back of the property. Jake hesitated. "That land hasn't been touched in years." "All the more reason to start," she said. He didn't argue. He handed her a pair of gloves and led her down the worn path, past the collapsed section of fence and the skeletal remains of a shed long forgotten. The meadow was exactly as they'd left it, windswept, tangled, rich with scents only Lena seemed able to name. She crouched low among the blooms, fingers brushing stalks of lavender and mint with reverence. "They're survivors," she said softly, "left alone, and still they give." Jake watched her, arms crossed. "You really think this patch of wildflowers could mean something?" Lena looked up at him. "Where you see weeds, I see potential. That's the difference between giving up and beginning again." He had no answer for that. Over the next few days, Lena rose early and worked the field with a rhythm that came not from urgency, but from patience. She harvested gently, never taking more than the plants could spare. She set up an old wooden table near the porch and laid out stems to dry in the sun. Annie helped, carefully arranging flowers into little bundles and labeling them with handwritten signs. Lavender, peppermint, lemon balm. Jake pretended not to watch them, but he noticed everything. The way Lena explained things to Annie as if she were already capable. The way his daughter's shoulders began to loosen when she laughed. The way the house no longer echoed with absence. One evening, Jake stepped out onto the porch and found Lena pouring oil into tiny amber glass bottles. The scent hit him instantly, soothing, warm, like memory itself. "What is it?" he asked. She didn't look up. "Lavender and rosemary. Helps with sleep. My grandmother called it night's breath." Jake picked up a bottle, turning it in his hands. "What are you going to do with these?" "Sell them," she said plainly. "Online." He blinked. "You're serious?" "Yes, I have pictures, a PayPal account. There's a place called Etsy. People like natural things there. If we label them right and ship in recycled paper, it will feel personal." Jake leaned against the porch rail, still holding the bottle. "And you think folks will buy this?" "They don't buy the oil," Lena said, finally looking up. "They buy the story, a second chance, a farm that smells like healing." Jake stared at her, as if seeing something new. "You really believe that?" "I have to," she said. "It's the only thing I brought with me." The first sale came 2 days later, then 5 more. By the end of the week, they were packaging orders with twine and handwritten notes that read, "Made with patience and peppermint. From our field to your hands." Jake watched as Lena showed Annie how to draw small hearts on the envelopes. "Every little thing matters," she said. He'd never seen his daughter this focused, or this joyful. And for the first time, Jake felt something he hadn't dared touch in years. Hope. That night, after the orders were packed and the dishes were done, Jake lingered by the kitchen sink. Lena stood at the doorway, her hands still smelling faintly of eucalyptus. "You really think we can make something of this?" he asked, voice low. "I think we already are," she replied. He turned to her fully, his eyes searching. "Why do you care so much about this place, about us?" She didn't flinch. "Because the world left you behind, and I know how that feels. But sometimes the forgotten places bloom the most beautifully, if someone just believes in them again." Jake swallowed hard. For a long moment neither of them moved. Then, softly, he said, "It's strange." "What is?" "How someone I didn't know a month ago is already teaching me how to see what I almost gave up on." Lena didn't reply. She just walked over, handed him a bottle of lavender oil, and said, "Start by sleeping. Tomorrow we harvest what the world called weeds." The wind carried a new smell that morning. Not manure, not damp hay, or the bitter tang of rusting metal. No, this scent was different, soft, almost tender, like something from another life. It slipped through the air like a secret, curling into the corners of the farmhouse, through the cracks of the weathered porch, into Jake Turner's lungs. He paused mid-step on his way to the barn and turned. Lena stood at the old wooden table with a basket of dried herbs, her sleeves rolled up, hair pinned back. She was mixing oils again, lavender, lemon balm, rosemary, and singing something under her breath. In a language Jake didn't understand, but somehow didn't need to. He leaned on the porch rail, arms crossed. "You always work this early?" he asked. She didn't jump. She simply looked up, eyes calm. "The plants are happier in the morning." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Plants have moods?" "Everything does," she said. "You just have to listen." He didn't know what to say to that. So he didn't say anything at all. Lena finished bottling the latest batch, small glass vials with handwritten labels in her neat cursive. "Night's breath," "Hope in a jar," "Sunlight for sad hearts." Jake squinted at one. "Hope in a jar? You selling this to hippies?" Lena smiled. "I'm selling this to people who forgot what peace smells like." He couldn't argue with that. The moment he uncorked one of the bottles, a wave of something calm and clean swept through him, like warm light on an old bruise. And then came the sound that would change everything. A car, not theirs. Jake stiffened. Visitors were rare, uninvited ones, practically extinct. A dusty SUV pulled into the gravel drive, kicking up clouds. A young woman stepped out, phone in hand, long red braids swinging down her back. She wore hiking boots, a vintage camera slung over her shoulder, and the kind of confidence Jake had never been able to cultivate. "Hi there," she called, walking up. "Sorry for the surprise visit. Are you Lena?" Lena wiped her hands on a towel. "Yes, can I help you?" "I'm Rowan Blake. I run a nature blog, Rooted and Wild. Someone posted your lavender oils on a homesteading group and I had to see the place myself." Jake glanced at Lena, then back at Rowan. "You're here about the oil?" Rowan beamed. "It's incredible. I used it last night and slept like a baby in a thunderstorm. Your story is so beautiful. Immigrant woman turns neglected field into healing garden. It's exactly what people need to hear right now." Jake bristled slightly. "This isn't a story, it's our life." Rowan's smile softened. "Exactly. That's what makes it powerful." She asked for a tour. Lena obliged. Jake stayed behind, unsure. But through the open windows he heard Lena explaining the distillation process, showing the drying racks, talking about how each herb had a mood, a memory, a message. Rowan filmed everything. And when she left 2 hours later, she promised to post the reel by tonight. Jake remained skeptical, but by nightfall the farm's inbox had over 60 messages. By morning, it had 300. Orders flooded in faster than they could fill them. People wrote from all over the country, Wisconsin, Oregon, even a woman from Brooklyn who wanted Lena's oil for her postpartum insomnia. They sent notes with their payments. I haven't slept well in years. This reminds me of my grandmother's garden. Thank you for making something with soul. Jake sat at the kitchen table, staring at the list of pending orders, eyebrows nearly touching his hairline. This is something, he muttered. Lena was packaging bottles, humming quietly. Annie was drawing hearts on the envelopes, her tongue poking from the corner of her mouth in concentration. It's not just about the oil, Lena said without looking up. It's about giving people something to believe in. We're not selling products, we're offering comfort. Jake rubbed the back of his neck. You think people are really that desperate? I think people are that lonely. The words hit harder than he expected. He looked at his daughter, then at Lena, and something in his chest cracked open just a little more. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He stood on the porch, a cup of tea in hand, watching the moon rise over the hills. The wind was cool, brushing against his face like a memory. The field behind the barn rustled in the darkness, alive now with purpose. Lena joined him a moment later, her own mug in hand. You okay? She asked softly. I don't know, he admitted. This attention, it's a lot. She nodded. You're used to being invisible. He gave her a sharp glance, then looked away. Yeah, maybe. They stood in silence for a long moment. Then he said, You know what surprises me? What? That it's working. That this field, this forgotten patch of earth, is actually giving something back. Lena sipped her tea. It always could. It just needed someone to see it. Jake turned to her. That applies to more than just the field, doesn't it? She met his eyes and didn't look away. I see you, Jake, she said. His throat tightened. He didn't know what to say. So instead, he reached over and gently touched her hand. And for the first time in years, the silence between them didn't feel empty. It felt full. The knock came at 9:17 a.m. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp. 3 raps, evenly spaced. The kind of knock that came with paperwork and deadlines, not pie or neighborly news. Jake froze at the sink, coffee mug halfway to his lips. Lena looked up from the table where she was sorting dried calendula petals. Annie, who had been drawing sunflowers on packaging slips, instinctively slid off her chair and moved to Lena's side. Jake wiped his hands on a towel and opened the door. A man in a crisp navy blazer stood on the porch, clipboard in hand. The Turner farmhouse reflected in his mirrored sunglasses. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. Mr. Turner, the man said. Jake nodded. Yeah. Stephen Graves, First Horizon Bank. I believe we've spoken over the phone. Jake sighed. A few times. Graves stepped forward, uninvited. We're at the end of the forbearance period. I need to walk the property, finalize the report for the foreclosure committee. Lena rose to her feet. Foreclosure? She asked quietly. Jake didn't answer. He couldn't. Graves glanced at her briefly. Ma'am. Then he moved past them, walking down the porch steps like he already owned the place. Jake followed, jaw tight. They moved in silence across the yard, Graves scribbling notes on his clipboard while Lena watched from the porch, her hands twisting the edge of her apron. He never told me, she whispered. Annie reached up and held her hand. He doesn't tell anyone. The inspection was methodical, cold, like surgery on something still breathing. Graves took photos of the barn's sagging roof, the cracked water tank, the patchy irrigation lines. When he reached the drying racks where Lena and Annie had hung fresh bundles of lemon verbena and yarrow, he paused. "What's all this?" "Herbs," Jake replied curtly. "We sell oils, small batch, online." Graves raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "That's not going to cover the debt." Jake didn't respond, because he didn't know if it would. Back inside, the tension sat heavier than any furniture. Jake slumped into a chair, running a hand through his hair. "I should have said something. I just thought maybe we had more time." Lena sat across from him, her expression unreadable. "How much do you owe?" she asked. He hesitated. "Jake." He met her eyes. $72,000 plus interest. The land was my dad's, but the equipment loan, the repairs, things got tight after Emma died. I took out more than I should have. Then the drought hit, the harvest failed, and I just kept pushing it off. Lena folded her hands. "And now, they gave me 90 days. That was 3 months ago." She took a slow breath. "Then we have 7 days." Jake looked at her like she'd spoken in another language, but she was already rising. "I need my computer." Within an hour, the kitchen had transformed into a makeshift war room. Lena spread out order forms, customer reviews, shipping invoices, and site analytics. She called Rowan, the blogger, who offered to feature the farm again with a Save This Sanctuary campaign. Annie, sensing the seriousness of the moment, quietly colored signs that read, "Healing Hill Farm needs your heart." Jake stood near the doorway, arms crossed. "This won't be enough." "We're not done," Lena said. She drafted a letter to their email subscribers, telling the story. Not of a man in debt, but of a daughter who'd begun to laugh again, a field that bloomed because someone chose not to give up, and a woman who'd crossed oceans to plant hope in forgotten soil. She ended it with one sentence: "Help us save the land that saved us." That night, the orders doubled, then tripled. Lena and Jake worked until 2 a.m., packaging bottles by lamplight, sealing envelopes with trembling fingers. But the best part came the next morning when Graves returned. He didn't knock this time, just marched up the porch, prepared to deliver bad news. Jake met him at the door. "I'd like you to see something," Jake said. They walked to the drying tables, now fully stocked. The barn, repaired with neighborly help, had been scrubbed and rebraced. Children from the town had painted murals on the walls, sunflowers, hearts, a picture of Annie holding a bundle of lavender. Lena met them at the entrance to the garage, where shelves of labeled oils now sat in neat, polished rows. A printed spreadsheet was in her hand. "Gross revenue from the last 2 weeks," she said, handing it to Graves. "Projected monthly growth. Pending partnerships with wellness blogs and small boutiques, we've already brought in over $28,000, with more expected." Graves frowned, reading the sheet. Jake stood beside her, his stance no longer apologetic. "We're not asking for charity," he said, "just time." Graves didn't speak for a long moment. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I'll note the file as under review. You've got 30 more days. If numbers keep trending, I can recommend suspension of foreclosure proceedings." Jake exhaled so deeply it seemed to pull from his ribs. "Thank you," Lena said. Graves gave a tight nod and left. When his car disappeared down the road, Jake turned to her. "You didn't have to do all this," he said. "It's not your responsibility." She looked up at him, eyes steady. "It is now." And in that moment, with the wind rustling through the healing fields and the scent of rosemary and mint swirling between them, Jake realized something. Lena hadn't just saved the farm. She had claimed it. And maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to claim him too. The summer evening was unusually dry. Even the wind felt brittle, like it might shatter if it moved too fast. Jake stood near the barn, checking the new hinges on the loft door. Lena had been teaching a local woman how to mix soils, and Annie was in the garden, carefully labeling each plant with hand-drawn signs. It was the kind of evening that lulled you into forgetting how fragile everything was. Until the smoke came. It started as a thin ribbon, barely noticeable, rising from behind the workshop where they kept the distillation equipment. Jake noticed it first. Just a shift in the air, a scent that didn't belong. Then Lena screamed. He turned, heart dropping into his boots. The back corner of the workshop was ablaze, flames licking up the side wall like they'd been waiting for permission. The dry wood caught fast, feeding the fire like a starving thing. "Annie!" Jake yelled. "I have her!" Lena's voice rang out. She was already holding Annie close, shielding her from the heat. Jake grabbed the hose, turned the valve, and cursed. The pressure was weak, barely a trickle. "Get to the house," he shouted. "Call 911. Lena nodded and ran, her arm wrapped tightly around Annie. Jake didn't wait. He grabbed a shovel, then a water bucket from the coop, and started flinging whatever he could find at the flames. But it was useless. The wind turned, fanning the fire until it roared. By the time the fire trucks arrived, the workshop was nearly gone. The scent of burnt lavender filled the air, sweet, scorched, unbearable. 3 hours later, the fire was out, but so was the light in Jake's eyes. He stood beside the smoldering ruins, hands on his hips, jaw clenched. Soot marked his face, and the front of his shirt was singed at the sleeves. The fire chief approached, helmet tucked under his arm. "Looks like faulty wiring," he said. "Old building, could have sparked from one of the heat lamps." Jake nodded hollowly. "I'm sorry," the man added, then turned to direct his crew. Jake didn't move. Lena approached quietly, a blanket around her shoulders. Annie had fallen asleep in the house, emotionally spent. Jake didn't look at her. "I should have known better," he said. "Should have had it rewired, should have double-checked the damn cords." "It wasn't your fault." "Yes, it was." His voice cracked. "I let you build something real, something beautiful, and I let it burn." Lena stepped closer. "Jake." But he wouldn't meet her eyes. "You should go." The words landed like stone. Lena stiffened. "What?" "You should go," he repeated. "There's nothing here for you now. I dragged you into a dream that was already dying." She stared at him, stunned. "You think I came here for a business?" she asked. "For a brand?" Jake said nothing. "I came here for the chance to belong somewhere, to build something with my hands, to matter." "You do matter," he said hoarsely. "Then don't push me away. I don't want to watch you lose everything." Lena's voice dropped. "Then stand next to me and help me rebuild." Jake finally looked at her. She stepped closer, her eyes shimmering. "You're not the only one who lost something tonight. That room, that equipment. It wasn't just tools to me, it was memory. My grandmother's way of life, my language, in glass bottles and steam." Jake opened his mouth, but nothing came. "So don't tell me to go," she whispered, "because I'm choosing to stay. Even now." And just like that, the fire wasn't the most powerful thing in the night. Hope was. They didn't sleep. Instead, they sat on the porch, watching the moon rise over the smoking field. Jake poured them each a cup of tea, what little remained, and they drank in silence. After a while, he spoke. "I've always run when things fell apart. After Emma died, I shut down. Told myself it was for Annie, but really it was easier not to feel." Lena didn't interrupt. "I thought, maybe if I didn't let anything new grow, I couldn't lose it." "You were grieving," she said gently. He nodded. I still am. Then let's grieve. And then let's build. He turned to her, eyes heavy. Why do you believe in this so much? Because broken things still grow, she said. Cracks let the roots in. By morning, the ashes had cooled. Neighbors came, some brought tools, others brought baked goods. A few just came to stand with them in silence. Jake and Lena cleared the wreckage side by side. The foundation was still intact. The land had not given up. Neither had they. And when the sun rose higher, casting golden light over the blackened ground, Jake saw something glinting among the ashes. A small tin box, warped but unopened. He picked it up, opened the lid, and found inside a bundle of dried lavender, tied with twine, and a note in Lena's handwriting. Beauty survives fire. So will we. Jake turned, found Lena standing beside him, and without another word, he pulled her into his arms. He didn't need to say thank you, she already knew. Annie's first garden began in a shoebox. It wasn't much, just a row of soil-filled paper cups on the windowsill, each holding a tiny seed Lena had salvaged from the ruined shed. But to Annie, it was everything. She labeled each cup in purple marker, lavender, mint, chamomile, and in one, with letters tilting like her heart still wasn't sure, hope. Jake watched her from the hallway, arms folded across his chest. It had been a week since the fire, a week of ash and ache, of neighbors with casseroles and words that didn't always know where to land. But, in the middle of it all, Annie was planting things. And Lena, God bless her, was letting the little girl lead. You think any of that will actually grow? Jake asked one morning, nodding at the cups. Lena glanced up from the kitchen sink. They don't need to, she does. He nodded, letting that sit in his chest a moment. The field behind the house, once wild and overflowing with scent, now carried the heavy silence of scorched earth. But Lena returned to it daily. Not to harvest, there was little left, but to listen, to kneel, to sift soil between her fingers, and to whisper in her mother tongue, as if the roots could still hear. Jake sometimes watched her from the porch, coffee in hand, trying to understand the patience it took to love something back to life. And every evening, Annie joined her. She'd bring her tin watering can and a basket for just in case we find something brave enough to grow again. Some days they returned empty-handed. Other days with a single stem of green or a leaf half-burned but holding on. One afternoon, Annie came running into the house, her cheeks flushed and eyes shining. "Daddy!" she cried. "Look what we found!" She held up a stalk of lavender, no taller than her forearm, bent at the top but still fragrant. Jake took it in his rough hands like it was something sacred. Lena followed behind, her smile soft. "She insisted it goes in water," she said. So they found a mason jar, filled it, and placed the stalk in the center of the kitchen table like a victory flag. That night, Jake caught Annie whispering to it. "Thank you for not giving up." The orders slowed, as expected, after the fire. But they didn't stop. The story had spread. Rowan's video now had over 100,000 views. The fire, the rebuild, the little girl with soil under her nails, and hope in her handwriting. It had all become part of the Healing Hill narrative. People weren't just buying oils anymore. They were buying a piece of the farm's resilience. Lena shifted the business to pre-orders while they rebuilt the workshop. Local friends helped hammer new beams and wire the space properly. A retired electrician offered his services for free, grumbling something about how he used to court a girl who smelled like peppermint. Jake didn't argue. He just handed the man a scone and thanked him. One morning, as Lena prepared a new blend with the salvaged herbs, Annie sat beside her with colored pencils and construction paper. "What are you drawing?" Lena asked. "A garden," Annie said. "My garden." She turned the page around. It was crude, just blobs of purple and green and yellow. But at the center was a stick figure in a red dress, holding hands with a smaller one in overalls. "That's me," Annie said, pointing to the smaller figure. Lena smiled. "And the other?" Annie hesitated. Then, very softly, she said, "You." The words hung in the air like perfume, light, tender, impossible to ignore. Lena felt something shift in her chest, a string pulled taut for too long, finally loosening. She reached over and took Annie's hand. "I would be honored to be in your garden." Annie leaned in and whispered, "Can I call you Mama someday?" Lena blinked, tears stinging at the edge of her vision. She nodded, unable to speak. From the doorway, Jake stood frozen, the exchange hitting him with more force than he expected. Not because he was afraid, but because it felt right. Later that evening, Jake found Lena on the porch. She sat cross-legged, watching fireflies dance over the field's edge. A new bottle of oil sat beside her, small, clear, labeled in Annie's handwriting. "After the fire." Jake picked it up, uncorked it. The scent was grounding, earthy with a trace of citrus and something warm, almost like cinnamon. "What's in it?" he asked. "Calendula, vetiver, orange peel, a little rosemary, and a dash of Annie." He chuckled. "She'll love that." He sat beside her. The wood creaked beneath them like it always had. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For staying." Lena turned to him. "I didn't stay, Jake. I grew roots." He nodded slowly, the words settling into him like rain after drought. After a pause, he asked, "Do you ever think about what's next?" She tilted her head. "For the farm? For us?" Her gaze didn't waver. "Every day." Jake took a breath. "And?" "I think something's growing here, even if we can't see all of it yet." He looked out at the field, now peppered with tiny signs of life. "Then maybe," he said, "it's time we planted something together, not just seeds." Lena smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made you believe in seasons again. They sat there until the stars arrived, and the porch became a sacred place, where fire had passed, but love had stayed. Jake Turner never thought he'd propose again. Not because he didn't believe in love anymore, though there had been a time he didn't, but because he had learned that love, the real kind, didn't always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it crept in like dew, quiet, persistent, life-giving, and sometimes it came with dirt under its nails and lavender in its hair. That morning, he found himself in the old tool shed, the one they hadn't used since before the fire. The light filtering through the cracked window fell on a dusty workbench where his father had once taught him how to sharpen blades and fix broken fence latches. Jake ran his hand along the scarred wood, then opened the drawer he hadn't touched in years. Inside was a tarnished silver spoon, old and thick, with the initials JT engraved at the handle's base. It had belonged to his mother, passed down from her mother before her. It wasn't valuable in dollars, but it had seen 3 generations of hardship and grace. Jake turned it over in his hand. It would do. He worked on it in secret, after Annie went to bed and Lena slipped out to walk the edge of the field. He hammered it flat, shaped it carefully, polished the silver until it gleamed again. It was crude, imperfect, a little lopsided, but it was his, and more importantly, it was theirs. He buried it in a small tin, just outside the spot where Lena had planted a new row of lavender, still fragile, but reaching. Then he waited. 2 days later, as golden light spilled across the hills and the scent of warm rosemary clung to the breeze, he asked Lena to walk with him. She wore a faded blue dress and a braid down her back. Her hands were stained with earth and oil, and her smile came slow, like it wanted to be sure the world was safe before it bloomed. They strolled toward the back field, past the new rows of mint and verbena, past the rebuilt shed now humming with quiet productivity. "This is where it started," she said softly, kneeling beside the lavender. Jake followed her gaze. "It's where I started seeing you." She turned, surprised. "What do you mean?" He crouched beside her, fingers brushing the soil. "At first, I saw someone brave, then someone steady, then someone beautiful, and then I realized I'd been looking for you long before I knew your name." Lena stilled. He reached into the soil and lifted the small tin box. She watched, eyes wide, breath caught. He opened it and held up the silver ring. Simple, hammered by hand, imperfect, like every real thing worth loving. "I don't have a perfect life to offer you," he said, voice steady. "But I have a home. I have a daughter who calls you her garden. And I have a heart that knows what it's like to break and still beat." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "I don't want this farm without you," he continued. "Not as a helper, not as a guest, as my wife." Lena reached for the ring, cradling it like a seed. She looked at him, not with shock or hesitation, but with something older, something truer. "Yes," she whispered, 1,000 yeses. They didn't celebrate with champagne or dancing. Instead, Jake cooked dinner, grilled cheese and tomato soup, Annie's favorite. When he told her the news, she squealed and threw her arms around Lena's waist, yelling, "I told you she was ours." Then she grabbed a crayon and drew 3 stick figures in a row, one tall with a hat, one with long hair and a smile, and one small with a flower in her hand. "This is our family," she said. Jake hung the drawing on the fridge beside the recipe Lena had written for after the fire. That night, long after the dishes were done and the house had gone quiet, Jake and Lena sat on the porch in the hush of late summer. "You could have had more," he said quietly. "Someone with a bigger house, a better job, a life with fewer splinters." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I didn't want perfect. I wanted real." He kissed the top of her head. "Then I hope I always stay a little broken." Lena chuckled. "You will." They laughed together, the kind of laugh that comes only when you know the worst is behind you, and the rest is yours to build. Across the yard, the new lavender shimmered under moonlight, the field no longer forgotten, but chosen, and buried beneath it, a ring made from a spoon, forged from memory and shaped by love, waited to be found by stories yet to come. The wedding was held in the orchard behind the house. There were no chandeliers, no tuxedos, no string quartets. Instead, there were rows of folding chairs from the church down the road, draped in linen Annie had dyed with marigold petals. There were bundles of dried lavender tied to fence posts, guests in cowboy boots and Sunday best, and a little girl in a crown of mint leaves walking barefoot down a path of scattered petals. Jake stood beneath the old apple tree, his shirt pressed and hair reluctantly combed, with a ring made from a spoon in his pocket and his heart in his hands. And when Lena stepped into the clearing, in a simple dress the color of cream and courage, the world tilted. Not in grand cinematic ways, but in the quiet, real ways that matter most. The ceremony lasted 10 minutes, but the applause at the end felt like thunder on soft soil. Lena didn't cry. Not during the vows, not during the kiss. But when Annie stood up after they were pronounced husband and wife, holding a crumpled piece of paper, and cleared her throat, her voice trembling, the tears came. "I wrote this," Annie said, "for Mama Lena." She glanced at Jake, then back at the crowd. "Once, I didn't remember how to laugh. I was scared to sleep. I thought the world had only room for me and Daddy, but then she came. She smelled like flowers and smiled like a soft song." Her voice cracked. She didn't try to fix me, she just stayed, and sometimes staying is the bravest thing. There wasn't a dry eye under that tree, especially not Jake's. The next few months passed like a breath held too long and then finally released. The business bloomed again, stronger this time, rooted deeper. Healing Hill Farm became more than a name. It became a place. Lena started workshops for immigrant women, those who had arrived in America with dreams that didn't fit in their hands. She taught them how to make oil, soap, balm, but more than that, she taught them how to begin again. Jake converted the old barn into a teaching space. He sanded every beam, replaced each window, carved a small wooden sign to hang above the door, made new. Customers no longer just came for the products. They came to see the field, to sit on the porch, to hear Lena's story. Sometimes they'd leave with a bottle of Sunlight for Sad Hearts, sometimes with a sprig of mint tucked in their coat pocket, but always they left with something more than they came with. One afternoon, a news crew showed up. Not the big networks, just a local lifestyle show. But the host, a woman with silver hair and a kind smile, asked questions with a sincerity that caught Jake off guard. "What do you think is the secret?" she asked him. "To all this?" Jake looked out at the rows of herbs, the drying racks, the laughter of children playing tag among the wildflowers. Then he looked at Lena, kneeling beside a new patch of lemon thyme, showing Annie how to pinch the stem just right. "I think," he said slowly, "we stopped trying to build a business and started building a life." The host smiled. "And the value of that?" Jake smiled too. "Priceless. But if you really want a number, I'd say it's a love worth millions." That evening, after the crew had packed up and gone, Jake and Lena sat on the hill as the sun dipped low. Annie ran circles around them with her dog, a mutt they'd adopted from the shelter who answered only to the name Pepper. Lena leaned against Jake's shoulder. "Do you ever wonder why it worked? Us?" "All the time," he said. "And?" "I think we didn't fall in love," he said. "We grew into it. Like the lavender, slow, rooted, resilient." She reached for his hand. "I used to think love was for people with something to offer. Money, beauty, status." He shook his head. "Love's for the broken, the brave, the people who show up even after the fire." Lena smiled, eyes glistening. "Then we're the richest people I know." Jake pulled her close, and together they watched the sky turn from gold to violet, the same shade as the field that brought them back to life. Autumn arrived without fanfare. The leaves turned gold, then rust, then let go one by one, as if they too had learned that surrender wasn't the same as defeat. The farm, once wild and wounded, now moved with rhythm. Rows of herbs waved in the breeze like old friends. The scent of rosemary and clove lingered in the air. The porch had new paint. The barn had new windows. The house had more laughter than it had in years. But it was never about perfection. It was about presence. And love, Jake Turner had learned, was nothing if not present. The day began like any other. Annie raced into the kitchen, hair still wet from her morning bath, holding a mason jar filled with dirt and 3 sprigs of thyme. "We have a visitor," she declared. Jake, holding his coffee, raised an eyebrow. "Friend or foe?" "Neither," she said. "A frog." He chuckled. "Let's hope Pepper doesn't think it's a snack." Lena came in from the garden, cheeks flushed from the crisp air. She carried a small box wrapped in craft paper and tied with twine. "What's that?" Jake asked. "A delivery," she said. "For someone in town who said her daughter can't sleep through the night. She read about our blends online." Jake leaned back. "From Montana to Manhattan, we're healing bedtime." Lena smiled. "One breath at a time." That afternoon, they hosted their first open farm day. It wasn't grand, just a handful of families, some regular customers, a local writer, and a few curious neighbors who had once doubted whether the mail-order bride and the widower would last the winter, let alone build an empire of scent and soul. Jake set up hay bales for seating. Annie led tours of her official garden, pointing proudly to each sign she'd hand-painted. Lavender for calm, mint for courage, chamomile for good dreams. Lena held a small workshop beneath the oak tree, teaching children how to make their own herbal sachets. The smell of dried orange peel and crushed basil floated through the air like a blessing. At sunset, Jake stood before the guests, awkwardly clearing his throat. "I don't give speeches," he began. "Never been good with words. But I wanted to say thank you, not just for buying what we make, but for believing in what we're growing." He glanced toward Lena and Annie. This farm was almost lost. I was almost lost. But then, one woman showed up with nothing but her hands and her heart, and reminded me that sometimes the best things grow out of soil everyone else forgot. The crowd clapped, some with tears, some with knowing nods. Lena reached for his hand, and Jake, who once feared the weight of loss more than anything, squeezed it without hesitation. Later that night, when the guests had gone and the stars had returned to their silent posts overhead, Jake and Lena sat on the porch with Annie curled between them. "She's almost too big to sit on our laps," Lena said softly. "Almost," Jake agreed. They rocked slowly in the wooden swing Jake had repaired last spring, the creak of the chain a lullaby all its own. "I've been thinking," he said. Lena looked at him, amused. "Always dangerous." "I want to write something," he said. "Put it on the gate at the front, for anyone who finds their way here." She waited. Jake took a breath. "Welcome to the farm of second chances, where broken things grow, and hope is something you can smell in the air." Lena leaned her head on his shoulder. "Write it." "I already did," he said. "Just needed your permission to believe it." In the months that followed, the farm didn't just survive, it belonged. It became the place a teacher came to recover from burnout. A widower brought his granddaughter to plant rosemary beside his late wife's name. A teen mother learned how to make soap and left with confidence she didn't know she owned. People didn't just come to buy, they came to remember, to begin again. And every time someone asked Lena, "How did you do it?" she always smiled and said the same thing: "I didn't do it alone." Years later, when Annie would walk the field in the quiet mornings, she'd pause near the far edge, where the first stalk of lavender had returned after the fire. She'd touch it gently, close her eyes, and breathe in. Not just the scent, but the story. The one that began when a struggling single dad met a woman the world said was too poor to be loved. And together, they built something that couldn't be priced. A home, a legacy, a love worth millions. Where are you watching from? We'd love to know where in the world you're joining us from. Drop a comment below. It always warms our hearts to see this little storytelling community grow across the miles. If this story touched you, brought you peace, or reminded you of something worth holding on to, we invite you to subscribe to Soul Moments Story for more heartfelt stories of love, hope, and second chances. There's always a new moment waiting to be shared. Thank you for spending your time with us today. From our heart to yours, we're so grateful you're here. Until next time, stay kind, stay open, and never stop believing in love.